Hey guys, it's Becky with Design Bundles, and I'm here today to bring you another tutorial in Silhouette Studio. So one of the most intimidating features in Silhouette Studio is tracing. So we're going to talk all about tracing, the different ways that you can trace, and of course our favorite tips and tricks along the way. So let's get started.
Okay, so before we go any farther, let me just say that while tracing is really exciting and a very useful tool, there is one important thing to remember. Just because you can trace something doesn't mean that you should. So I'm just throwing it out there that before you start tracing images, you do need to make sure that you have either gained commercial rights for that image by purchasing them, or perhaps you have downloaded them from a royalty-free website. That sort of thing is okay. Just please make sure that you know what your rights and responsibilities are. I'm not going to harp on it, but I just wanted to point out that not only is it the right thing to do as a fellow crafter, but it's also the legal thing to do and the way to keep yourself out of trouble. So, with all the heavy stuff out of the way, let's proceed to talk about tracing. Alrighty, so here we are in Silhouette Studio, and as promised, we are going to talk all about the tracing panel. So let's go ahead and identify the tracing panel. It is over here on your right-hand side. If you hover over it, it, in my opinion, looks like a piece of toast. Some people say a butterfly, but basically it says open the trace panel. You can click on the icon and it will open. Now it's also important to notate if you cannot remember the icons, that's okay. You can come up to the top menu, click on panels, and there's also access to your trace panel right there. Now when we're talking about tracing, we're talking about being able to trace clip art and photos and that sort of thing. Any type of picture that you can bring into Silhouette Studio is a picture that you can trace and potentially turn into a cut file for your cutting machine. I'm going to copy and paste over a simple image for us to practice with, and it's a pineapple. So let's take a look at what this pineapple does if we were to try to use it as is. If I click over to my send panel, you'll see that Silhouette Studio registers this image as a rectangle. Okay, now that is because that is the outline definition of the actual image. Silhouette Studio does not actually pick up that there is a design inside that we would want to cut. So basic tracing says that we can come over here, click on select trace area, and then draw the box around the image that we want to trace. Now, we selected black and white because anytime that you have an image that has a lot of contrast, you get really great tracing results. So try to avoid using images that have light or similar colors because a lot of times those will register as the same color in terms of contrast. So we're going to stick with solid fill, and I want to talk to you about the threshold. The threshold is very useful in terms of picking up lighter and darker colors and differentiating between the two. So this is black and white, so you don't get a lot of difference, but if you notice really close, it does start to pull away from the edge of my design. Okay. If I increase the threshold back up, it fills in the design completely. Now for a black and white design, that's exactly what we want to do. And if we were working with a design that had a lot of small points to it, we would want to make sure to reduce our scale. Now 4 is the lowest that it goes, but think of this like pouring sand into a jar versus pouring marbles. The smaller you make the scale, the more complete of a fill you can get with those little pixels for the tracing. Now, the very basic tracing, I can just hit trace and it will trace the entire image. Okay, now if we were to look at this in our send panel, you'll notice that Silhouette Studio will now actually cut out the pineapple. But let's take it back a few steps and let's talk about what would happen if we chose trace and detach. Now it doesn't look like anything has been done, but let me show you again in the send panel. Now, it would first appear that we now just have the original rectangle and the pineapple. But what we actually have is it has separated the back of the pineapple from the actual pineapple itself. Okay, so in terms of that, we would simply group these together and we could delete the background. And basically we would be left with the pineapple as we intended. But this is most useful when you are doing a print and cut image, because there's really no reason for a simple black and white image for you to need to use trace and detach. This one doesn't seem like it would be that big of a deal, but getting in the default of using trace and detach can cause confusion when you start working with more complicated designs. It can make you believe that something has been traced when it actually has not been. Okay, so try to use just the regular trace option unless you're working with a print and cut image, and then you can start playing with the trace and detach. Now, let's go ahead and talk about modifying this after we have traced it. If you notice, if I right-click and choose Ungroup, it ungroups all of my individual pieces. That is true for trace and detach images. Okay, but let me show you. I'm just going to back up a couple steps here. And we're going to go back to our regular trace. Okay, now if I remove this pineapple from the picture, I want to show you if I right-click, there's no ungroup option. Okay, this is because traced images are automatically set to a compound path. And that's okay, and most of the time you won't have to do anything with that. But what I want to show you is that you can choose Release Compound Path, and that will unlock those little pieces. Now, it's important to not release compound path unless you need to, because it's very easy to accidentally move one of these pieces that you don't intend to, and then it messes up your design. But I just wanted you to know that if you're tracing something and you need to remove a piece, then you're going to need to release the compound path in order to take care of that. Also, say I wanted to cut this in different colors, I would be able to group the top part of my pineapple and then group the bottom part, and now I can not only fill those with different colors, but I would be able to cut them with different colors as well. So there are several reasons why you would want to release the compound path, but just do so carefully. That way you can keep your design intact the way it was intended. Okay, let's move on to a more complicated design. This is a pineapple clip art that I purchased from designbundles.net, of course, and this is a really good example of what we're looking for in contrast, and then also tracing by color. Now, tracing by color is a feature of Designer Edition and higher, but it is also important to explore and examine that so that you know, hey, maybe this is a feature that's worth upgrading for. The trace by color is up here, the top middle icon, and you get a little dropper. You simply click trace by color, and then you can click on whatever color you want to trace. I'll start with the green, and you notice it traces this green area that I've placed the dropper on. Now, I can choose all areas, and it will pick up all areas with that shade of green, which in this case is what I want. But say, for example, I wasn't getting a very good result, there were more areas that I wanted to include, then this is where you can increase your tolerance. And what that does, because all of these pieces are green and we're increasing the tolerance, it is allowing Silhouette Studio to pick up similar shades of green within the same spectrum of the original color that we used the dropper on. Now, depending on the file that you're using and the results you want to achieve, this may or may not be useful, but it's definitely an important tool to go ahead and talk about. For this situation, I am going to reduce the tolerance back, and I will simply choose trace. Now I'm going to repeat this process, trace by color, and I will do this for each shade of green. I will choose all areas, trace, select the dropper again, choose the lightest color, and select trace. Now, you'll see I have all 3 of the green pieces for the top of my pineapple. Now let's go ahead and talk about the yellow. I'm going to click Trace by Color and click on the yellow. Now, you can see, let's go ahead and hit all areas to get that part above her eye. You can see that it does only select that shade of yellow. Again, that's okay as long as you're wanting to omit the other parts. Now, in this particular circumstance, I'm actually not a big fan of the X's, so I will increase my threshold until it fills in the X's as well. Now, also notice that it's picking up some shades of green. Okay, that's because we're increasing that tolerance, so that's just bound to happen. You can decrease your tolerance, but then you get the X's back. So it just depends on where you're going with the design and how you want things to play out. I'm going to take the tolerance back down. I do not want it to include any of the pieces of green. So I'll simply hit trace. Now with the yellow done, you'll notice that I also get this rectangle around my pineapple. Now let's take a look at why that is. It has picked up that this area is not closed. Okay, that happens sometimes, and we will talk about how to fix that. Okay, but let's go ahead and finish our tracing. Open the trace panel back up, go back to Trace by Color, and I will go ahead and trace the black. Again, I'm going to select all areas, choose Trace, and I have one final color, and that is the pink. Okay, so all the areas of my design have been traced. So I'm going to move a copy off to the side and delete my original. Now what I can do is I can go through, I'm going to open my color fill panel, and just for kicks and giggles, I'm going to go ahead and fill this in using my dropper tool with the exact shades that match my clip art. I'm not going to fill in the main pineapple yet, but I will go ahead and fill in the other parts of the design. So let's move a copy of that yellow pineapple off to the side. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm doing, I'm using a shortcut on my keyboard for duplicate. It is simply the Control button and the right directional arrow on my keyboard. Now, if that's not something that you are comfortable with or you can't remember, you can copy and paste, or you can use the duplicate icons in your replicate menu. You'll see I have duplicate right here, and I can duplicate in any direction. And I promise that there's a reason that I do it this way, and we'll again talk about that once we get towards the end. So once I zoom in closer, like we talked about, those 2 pieces are actually not attached. So I cheat, but this is what I do. I draw a rectangle and I overlap it just the tiniest bit. Can you see? There we go. This is the better representation. Can you see how it overlaps right here? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, using my drag box, both the rectangle and my pineapple, and I will right click and choose Weld. Now let's take a look at what that does. If I release the compound path, I can then delete that rectangle. Okay, I'm not going to yet, but again, you just have to trust me that it's all going to make sense in a minute. I'm actually going to delete those because I don't need those and it'll mess up my plans for you. But I am also going to go ahead and delete all of the inside pieces to this pineapple. Remember I said I wasn't a fan of the X's, but I couldn't get them to separate out through tracing, so I was able to just do that the manual way. So now, remember I said I had a plan and I was going to explain why I used the duplicate, because now if I duplicate again to the left, it puts that circle right back where it belongs. Okay, I can delete that, and now I will delete the rectangle. So let's talk about that for just a moment, because in this situation that probably doesn't seem like it's a really big deal. But when you're designing, and especially you're tracing, and you need these pieces to line back up, it can kind of be a big deal to get that alignment just right. So if you always get in the habit of using that duplicate, where you duplicate one to the right or one to the left, then it makes it easy to also use the duplicate to move back in the original position. So just something to keep in mind. Not everybody is a real big fan of doing that. I am though, so I just kind of go with the flow. So let's color in our pineapple. I'm going to select that shade and I'm going to send to back. I can now delete my original if I want. And just because I'm an aesthetic person, I am going to change my line color to transparent. So I have basically turned that clip art into an SVG file that I would be able to cut and layer myself. So that's definitely something to kind of pat yourself on the back for. Now, I will say this, not all clip art creators allow you or want you to use their clip art in this fashion. And also, just because I took this clip art and turned it into a different format, that doesn't make it my clip art. The design still belongs to the original designer. So just know what you're purchasing and know what rights and responsibilities come along with that in using that design. And last but not least, let's talk about tracing photos. Okay, so I won't lie, I actually have a cheat that I like to use for photos. It does not involve Silhouette Studio, but I promise we're going to come back and look at the same photo in Silhouette Studio. But I just couldn't get by without showing you guys this gem. So I'm going to choose Upload a Picture. And of course, I have a picture in mind already. One thing I like about this photo is that it had a fairly clear and concise background. So when I scroll down, you'll see that I have some options, right? Up at the top. So this was my original photo, and this is what it's giving me in return. Now, what I can do is I can go through the different options, and it will give me different results. And I can go through all these until I find either one that I like or until I give up and go back to Silhouette Studio to do it the hard way, which is fine. So overall, I didn't get bad results. But what I was saying before was that this photo does have a pretty good background in that there's not a whole bunch of noise around his immediate body and face. Okay, so that will be useful. And I just want to say that, you know, this is a really neat tool, but don't be afraid to do this in Silhouette Studio. And we're going to take a look on doing that right now. All right, so back in Silhouette Studio, we do have a few weapons in our arsenal that are going to make the tracing easier. I will not say that tracing photos is a super easy thing to do, but it can be done. So what we're going to do first is we have the image effects panel. Now, I do believe that the image effects panel is designer edition and higher, so you may not have all these options, but I have found that the grayscale to turn this into black and white can be useful. And then I also want to head over to the contrast, because if I can give this photo more contrast, then it's also going to help my tracing. So I'm going to hit apply on both of those. And now I'm going to go back to my trace area. Now, in theory, I don't really need the top or the side of this. This is the fence surrounding their dugout. I really just want to trace this guy right here. So I'm going to try to reduce my area to not include those extra parts. Okay, so this is where your threshold can come into place. You'll notice that the lower my threshold goes, the less of the design is filled in. Okay, now with pictures like this, you do want to be careful because you don't want too much, but you also need to make sure enough of the design is traced that you can tell what the image is. What I'm actually going to do for this picture is I'm going to do a double trace of kind of low lights and highlights, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to start off with doing a threshold of 65. And that gives me a lot of my detail, and this is picking up pretty much all of the dark areas, okay? I'm also going to reduce my scale just to make sure that I get in all those little nooks and crannies if possible. Okay, I'm going to hit trace. Now, let me just show you what I did. Remember, I used my duplicate. I can delete that out. Now, if I fill this in with black, because that's essentially what I traced, and change my line color from red to transparent, you can see I got pretty good results. I lost a little bit in the face, okay, but that's not a big deal. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing, but now, and all I did was duplicate back over. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to use that trace by color, and I'm going to choose gray because that's the part that I want to pick up. I'm going to make sure to choose all areas. Now you see I got a lot of extras around the outside. That's okay because we can get rid of those later if we need to. I'm going to increase my tolerance. And basically all I'm trying to do is pick up some of the extra parts of the image that they're not black, but they're not necessarily white either. So now I'll hit trace again. I ended up with a tolerance of 18, but of course that'll vary picture to picture. Now this will take a minute just because we are picking up so much of that image. Once it's done processing, then we can go ahead and remove the image. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill this in with a softer gray. And I want to send to back. And then of course I'm going to change my line color to transparent. So I ended up with a little bit of two-tone. Now, if I want to, I can play with these colors until I get something that I'm happy with. And I think that's important when you're working with traced images. There we go, that one's not so bad. If I go back to black, what if I darken this gray up a little bit? But basically, it's important to play with your traced images like this if you're going to try to cut this. Because if you're working with a two-tone image and you're going to put this much time and effort into getting an end result, then you definitely want to make sure it's everything you wanted it to be. So I'm going to take this original photo out, and then I can decide how much of this I want to keep. Of course, I want to get in as close to this black as possible. So what I'm going to do is I will zoom in, and I'm going to draw a box that closely lines up with my black. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my drag box to select the gray and the rectangle, but I'm not touching my black. I'm going to open my modify panel and choose crop, and it should crop it down for us. Now, once that's been taken care of, you do want to group them back together because as you can see, it broke it out into all the little pieces. And that's okay. Group it back together and send to back one more time. Okay, so let's pause here. Now, it's important to notate that although we got decent tracing results, that does not mean that this is a project we want to tackle easily trying to cut with our silhouette. Now, a lot of that depends on size, and it also depends on your skill and ability with cutting small details. So I just want to say that even if you get good results in the software, because we're dealing with so many small pieces, okay, I just don't want you to expect perfect results when trying to cut and weed this on your own. But in theory, we got pretty good results from this, and I would be able to, even if I didn't use the gray at all and I just used that black, I could put this on a nightlight or a picture frame, or there are just so many options that I can use this type of design for. And a lot of people like to trace photos for, memorial gifts and anniversary gifts and that sort of thing, when photos are, very sentimental and just have a lot of meaning. So definitely don't be afraid to play with the photos, whether it's in the Pick SVG website or here in Silhouette Studio.
So, how was tracing, right? really, really awesome once you get the hang of it. And Silhouette Studio makes it so easy. They give you so many tracing tools to be able to take care of all your tracing needs. So, really excited we were able to explore that with you, and I really appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, make sure you put them in the comments because we do come back and check in with you guys. And of course, if you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe because we have so many fun tutorials planned for you in the future. Thanks for watching.